This took place in upstate New York when I was about 23 years old in the winter of 2018. I often look back on this incident and now realize as to just how stupid I was back then. For some context, I had just graduated from college and was living with my boyfriend in his apartment building in the suburbs. I'd like to point out that the area wasn't the nicest nor was the safest. It was a notorious hotspot for drug dealers, and sirens would often be heard a few times a week. One night, we had gotten into a huge fight because of our landlord, and it eventually led up to me leaving the house. I put on my snow boots and coat and walk outside crying while walking down the edge of the sidewalk in the snow. Needless to say, it was freezing outside, and at that point I was thinking about turning back when I see a pair of headlights coming down the road. About 10 seconds later, a car pulls up next to me and the person driving rolled down their window. Inside was a man who looked to be in his mid-40s wearing a baseball cap. "Hey there, are you lost?" Still being upset about the whole ordeal, I gave a friendly smile and shook my head to say no, hoping he would get the hint to leave me alone. However, he didn't seem to get the message, because he kept asking me if I needed help. I then blurted out no and told him that I was fine, but he then said that he'd be willing to take me anywhere I needed to go. Seeing as my boyfriend would probably not have let me back into the house for a while, I asked him if he could take me to my parents' house. He smiled in a way I can't even seem to describe and opened the passenger side door, and I got in to give him the address. His name was Jeff, and we talked through most of the car ride about the whole situation with my boyfriend and if I were going to break up with him or not. He started to agree with me on most things, and we even exchanged numbers so that he could help me know what to say to my boyfriend. At one point during the car ride, he had apologized and asked if we could stop for gas as he was running low. He then tells me that he's short on money and asks if I could lend him some. Let me point out that this guy is driving a 2018 Lexus LS, which is most certainly not a cheap car, and he was also decently well dressed. Not thinking anything of it, I pull out my small purse and hand him a $10 bill. He gets his gas and he starts driving again, and that's when I noticed he was taking me in the opposite direction of my house. It was hard to tell because of just how dark it was, and the snowfall didn't help. I respectfully asked him where he was going, but there was no response. He just continued to focus on driving, not even acknowledging the question I just asked. He drives for another 5 minutes and pulls up in front of an exit sign. "You know, before I drop you off, I have to show you something." I told him that it was fine and that I just really wanted to get home, but he insisted that I get out of the car. "Come on, I just want to show you something behind that sign." My heart sank into the pit of my stomach, and it seemed as if I had no other choice but to comply with him. I step out of the car, and as we're about halfway to the sign, I then see a police car coming down the road. I start waving my arms up in the air, screaming for him to stop, and the guy then runs back to his car and takes off down the road. Thankfully, the police car stops and calls back up, and eventually ends up giving me a ride home. But as far as I know, the man was never caught. I still have no idea as to what he wanted or what he wanted to show me behind that sign. I don't know if he was going to rape me or if there were other people hiding behind that sign ready to rob me or something much worse. But whatever it was It obviously wasn't good. When I was about 13, my family and I moved into an old house in a rural part of Wisconsin. It was at least 80 years old and was also in pretty good condition for a house that old. That being said, it wasn't anything too impressive. It was just your standard home appropriate for a family of 4. Behind the house were some woods that went on for about a good 10 miles. And after the woods came the school we'd be going to. One day, it was snowing outside as usual, and my mom had asked if I could take my 12-year-old sister outside to play. As much as I didn't want to, I complied and put on my gloves and coat and went outside with my sister. Needless to say, it was freezing outside even with our coats on. Her and I played around in the snow, made snow angels, had snowball fights, and just a bunch of kid stuff. At one point, I was in the process of building a snowman for her, when I glanced over toward the tree line and noticed a structure about 20 or so feet away. Right then and there, I knew that it couldn't have been the school, as it was much further down. In fact, I really didn't know what it was, as several trees were blocking my view, and the snowfall didn't make my vision any better. Being the daredevil I was, I tell her that we should go check it out, and after convincing her several times, in the end, she had to agree. As we were making our way over toward the structure, I then came to the realization that it was an old treehouse. It wasn't in great condition, but I could tell that it must have been a really nice one many years back. Below the treehouse was an old wooden ladder with a few missing planks held up by pieces of rope. At this point, I knew I had to do it, and there was no turning back. My sister then taps me on the shoulder and says, "What if we find a dead body?" I tell her to stop being so overdramatic and that there was likely nothing up there. So, long story short, I climb up the ladder with the rope surprisingly still holding together, even with my weight. After about a good minute of climbing, I then saw what was inside. What I found chilled me to the bone. In the corner laid a rotting deer hoof that appeared to be cut off. A broken oil lamp laid in the center of the floor, which was clearly smashed, along with multiple beer cans. The wooden walls of the inside were poorly graffitied with symbols of Satan and creepy monster faces, and spray-painted words that were somehow related to death. What the hell happened here? Was this some sort of hiding place for some sort of cult? Either way, I was in no mood to find out what this treehouse was for and didn't want to know. I told my sister that I found nothing and didn't end up telling my parents about it, and I didn't want to get the authorities involved. Till this day, I still don't know what that hidden treehouse was for or as to why it was abandoned. But this one experience was enough to creep me out for a very long time. So this happened about a year ago during the winter in my first semester in college. I work at a retail clothing store in a shopping center, which was quite a ways from my house. Since I didn't live close to work, I asked for day shifts so that I could get home at a decent hour to catch up on schoolwork and personal needs. I didn't have a car and my mom was almost always working during the day, which meant that I had to rely on public transportation to get to my house. It was a pain having to pick up people at multiple stops, but it was pretty much the only way home. One day, my boss had asked me to work late as one of the workers had called in sick. Seeing as I didn't have class the next day, I told him that I could. Even though I really didn't want to, it was extra pay at the end of the month, and I figured the late night shift wouldn't be that much of a hassle compared to the day shifts. Long story short, I work for a good 5 hours, and when my shift finally ended, I go to the bus stop and wait for the bus while freezing in 30-degree weather, and the snow was piling like crazy. I sat down at the bus stop, hoping the bus would get here soon when my iPhone died. I was pissed to say the least, so with nothing to do, I pull out my sketchbook from my backpack and doodle to keep myself occupied. About 3 minutes later, I hear footsteps in the snow to my left and turn to see a man I had never seen before approaching me. He wore a black long-sleeved shirt, a pair of torn jeans, and was wearing a cap. I thought nothing of it and assumed he was just another person waiting for the bus. He came right up to me and immediately sat down next to me about 2 feet away. I tried not to pay attention to him and just focused on my drawing when he turned his head to me and says the following. "You know, you're very pretty. I really like your hair." I tell him, "Thank you very much," and continue to work on my drawings, trying not to pay any attention to him. He then proceeds to ask me if he could have my number, and I kindly told him no and telling him I have a boyfriend. Of course, this was a blatant lie because I wasn't going to give my number to a person I didn't know. He then gets up and says it was nice to meet me, and he told me his name was Sparrow. I told him it was cool to meet him too, even though I was creeped the hell out on the inside. For whatever reason, I told him my name and he went on his way. Eventually, the bus finally came and I got home, not thinking anything of my encounter with the man. The next afternoon, my mom drove me to work, and when I clocked in, one of my coworkers told me something I wasn't expecting. "You know, earlier this morning, we had someone come in the store named Sparrow, asking for you. He said he was here to pick you up." When I was a kid, I moved to my dad's house after my parents had gotten separated. My dad would constantly be the one taking care of me and driving me to school to benefit me. Oftentimes, I'd have to walk home from school as my dad had worked for most of the day and night, so I wouldn't be seeing him as much. One night, my dad had been called into work due to a possible blizzard emergency, which looking back made sense as it was snowing like crazy out. My dad trusted me to stay home for the night and felt I was mature enough to do it. After about 2 hours or so before he left, I sat down on the couch drinking hot chocolate while watching a movie when the home phone rang. I figured that it was either a scammer or somebody asking for my dad, which I had no interest in sharing stuff like that since I was only 9. However, the phone began to ring a second time, so I could only assume it was bad news, or even my dad. I picked up the phone and said hello, but there was no response. I said hello once again, and this time I heard a very loud, blood-curdling scream from the other end. It was at that point when I realized that I heard it from somewhere else other than the end of the phone. My front yard. I ran over to the window, and from our security light, I was able to see a very tall, lanky figure standing in the snow. However, given the fact that it was dark out, I couldn't see his face or any features. They then walked away out of sight, disappearing into the dark, and I never got another call or heard another scream after that.